Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode. With me today, we've got Joe SealDriver. He is a veteran in the shared mobility world, from bike to car sharing and everything in between. He's risen through the ranks at Zipcar, followed by becoming the MD of ShareNow. He went on to lead OFO here in the UK, which was one of the first global bike sharing schemes before founding Havn. Havn is a pioneering ride-hailing company using a fleet of electric vehicles. They're operating in a fascinating sector where there's clearly a high demand, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, as consumers are demanding fast, convenient, and sustainable transport that allows for social distancing. Welcome to the show, Joe.
Hi, Joe. Nice to be here. Thanks very much for having me.
I'd like to point out, actually, that the entire introduction for Joe was written by myself, but the only word that he wanted changing was to replace veteran, which I originally put down as legend in the mobility world. But nonetheless, it's good to have you on the show, Joe. I've thoroughly enjoyed watching Havn's growth to date, particularly as you operate a 100% electric fleet. I'd love to learn a little bit more about you, Joe, and what made you think that a decade ago you wanted to step into the world of revolutionizing the way people move around towns and cities?
There's two answers to that. The first answer is I fell into it, having done a degree in environmental science and worked at the Eden Project and had done some sustainability consultancy coming straight out of university. Really am fascinated with the way in which we move, and I think we have a huge amount to do to improve it. But there's also another answer, which was that when I was 13, walking with some family friends, a friend of my mother and father's was doing very well working for IBM. And I said, what's going to be the next IT boom? She said, the environment. So that's why I did the Environmental Science University as well. So I've kind of always wanted to progress my career within the environmental sector, partly from that insight, because I knew it was going to be a boom area. And it's also where I'm interested in personally.
Absolutely. Excellent. I mean, people have to move every day. The transport market is booming, specifically micromobility. I'm aware you've kind of stepped into both car sharing and bikes and scooters. Of course, the shared game versus ownership is an interesting phenomenon, an ongoing debate. It's a question that we'll actually answer shortly in this podcast. But really want to jump into Havn specifically and how you went from car sharing and bikes through to starting a luxury chauffeur service using electric vehicles.
I worked with the incubator or the studio for Jaguar Land Rover in Motion Ventures, which is the corporate venturing arm of Jaguar Land Rover. So I went to work for them in a position which is quite a grandiose title. It's entrepreneur in residence. And what you end up doing is working within their innovation arm and coming up with business cases and coming up with ideas. And luckily enough, Havn was one we were looking at, and basically taking the premium electric vehicle, the I-Pace, and applying that to the chauffeur market, but doing that with a real twist. When we looked at the market in London in particular, we saw that the service quality was variable via competitors, Uber and the like. We saw that there was a need to treat chauffeurs and with respect and to work with them. The differentiation between the different services was really often came down to the individual that was driving you, not the car and the service they delivered. And on top of that, we realized that there was a space where we could innovate and allow the customer to tailor their journey prior to getting in the vehicle through selecting their own preferences, such as temperature, music, do not disturb modes, sharing notes with the chauffeur in advance, and actually also being able to tailor the experience within the car. So customers have onboard entertainment and can select things in the vehicle.
There's an age-old question I'm sure investors have always asked you. Is that how you go about differentiating from Uber, the incumbent in many of the cities in the UK?
But when we first took a look at the market and thought that's exactly where we'd position ourselves, and it's quite easy to see that there's been a lot of innovation from other players, including Uber, in a response to Havn, which is really good to see. But the differentiation really came down to the quality of service that the chauffeurs provided. That is really it. It's quite easy to put stuff in an app, temperature and do not disturb features, etc. But what's really hard is to do the consistent service level, making sure you're there on time, making sure that the chauffeur says the right thing, the vehicle's clean, all of those little touches. So that's what we've managed to kind of carve out, and that's why people come back. And we've actually recently had a majority investment from the global company Blacklane, which is been going since 2011. They've taken a majority stake in Blacklane, in Havn, in December last year.
Amazing. And there's clear validation of the growth trajectory of the company and clear the team strength as well. So that's fantastic news. And I'm aware that you're now global sales director, is that right?
Yeah, at Blacklane. So double hatting at the moment. And, Blacklane is running more electric vehicles. He's going from strength to strength to recover from the pandemic.
Just to touch on the subject that I talked about at the beginning, the ownership versus shared model is certainly a fascinating debate that is ongoing at the moment. Ultimately, urbanization is taking place. People are moving into cities at great speed. Likewise, cars are typically parked for 95% of its life, just depreciating on driveways. So it'd be really interesting to get your thoughts on how the ownership versus shared model will expand over the coming years with cars, of course, but also with bikes, scooters, and everything in between. Do you think there's a space for ownership, or is it going to be shared for the future that will dominate the space?
I think it's a mixed bag. If I'm being honest, I think you've got certainly the rise of shared services, also the rise of subscription services, and hopefully the reduction in ownership of private vehicles. And I'm working within the ride-hailing or chauffeur industry, and I'm focused on electrifying that business. But I also understand that is electrifying that business is a brilliant thing to do, and it's going to reduce carbon, and it's going to change the way we emit in cities and improve air quality. That said, we also need to change the amount of people that are traveling in vehicles overall. So a premium service is one where people pay for that privilege, and I think we should be charging the end user the right amount of money for the privilege to be in a more polluting or more space taking up vehicle, and that includes parking and it includes the journeys around town. And I don't think we actually necessarily price effectively there. So you're saying that 95% of the cars that are parked on the street, I often think if I was going to Airbnb my parking space, how much would I get from that?
Yeah, I mean, car parking in London is immensely expensive. I just ride my push bike around town, so I can't empathize too much. But everything can be rented nowadays. There's so many different websites and platforms to rent out space and take those assets to repurpose them. Likewise, car parks becoming smaller and less logical to use, particularly with one-way systems, widening cycle lane infrastructure, particularly in the wake of the pandemic. It makes less and less sense to be owning and driving a car in big cities.
We might actually have to buy a car at some point in the future, my wife and I, because we're expecting our first child, and we need to start thinking about that option, or that those kind of public transport options not being as available to us as we're moving house as well. And I'm obviously want to buy an electric vehicle, but it's limited. It's not just about the way space is used; it's also the size of the vehicles themselves. And you mentioned subscription earlier on. I think there's a load of really interesting stuff happening in that space. A lot of money being pumped into it, particularly at the premium end. So if you look at all of the competitors that the e-bike competitors like Van Move, Cowboy, Dance, and a few others coming into the market, everyone wants to be the iPhone, and everyone's trying to go for the top part of the subscription service. And I wonder whether or not there's actually more scale for subscription at a lower end, and that's something that I'm keen to see if people look at, especially in the cycling industry.
Yeah, amazing. I'm all for subscription. I've got a Swap Feets bike that I subscribe to, £14.99 a month, and this isn't a promo. I think it's fascinating space, no lock-in contracts, but I think the same concept could be applied to really anything, including cars. If you wanted to rent one on a subscription basis. And that just helps to reduce congestion, because you wouldn't subscribe to a car when you wouldn't need it necessarily. And yeah, certainly beneficial for the circular economy. And that actually brings me on quite nicely onto my next question, which is around the concept, or should I say near reality, of fully autonomous driving. And in 5 years, could be less, we might be seeing cars driving themselves to the extent that they've reached level 5 safety. Now, for those listening, level 5 means that the vehicles do not require any human attention at all. So how does that implicate, or how does that impact Havn, or I should say now Blacklane? Because you'll have chauffeurs, they're providing that personalized experience. Will they be out of a job? Will they be repurposed elsewhere?
When I was running Drive Now in the UK, there was a huge amount of hype around autonomous vehicles in 2013 all the way through to 18, and lots of money being put into the sector. And when I look at some conferences now been online, they're saying the same things pretty much. Doesn't seem to have moved on that much, despite all the money that's been put into it. And a few big players have kind of pushed out their predictions of when those levels will happen. So I'm beginning to be more skeptical about the reality of autonomous vehicles. I can see the place for them on the motorway. I can see the place for them in factories and ring-fenced areas like airports. Where I can't see them working is in central London, when kids know that they're going to stop from them, they can jump out in front of them. I can't see them working in big cities like Delhi for any time soon. And honestly, in our sector, in the premium mobility sector, when the chauffeur is in a lot of ways the concierge and the host to the city, I think there will always be a premium experience where some customers will want to have a chauffeur there. But to answer your question, in summary, I'm waffling a bit. Don't think it's happening anytime soon. Probably not relevant to us in the near term.
Many customers will still want that personalized experience from a human and not autonomous driving computer. I met a guy who used to work in our mobility office, London Connectory, and I sat with him for an hour whilst he explained how to code artificial intelligence within autonomous driving, from which to determine if there was to be an accident and there was no way to avoid it. And unfortunately, there was someone tried to cross and the car was moving at speed. What would the car hit? And it's a scary topic, but certainly necessary when coding a computer to drive itself. To a certain extent, moral or human-like decision-making is removed, and it would likely just kind of hit anyone, whether it's a young or old person. But actually, the computer would needs to be told through hundreds or thousands of hours of footage and coding that into the brain of the car to determine who the car should really hit. So it's a very interesting subject matter, but will be very much part of that reaching level 5 safety. If there was to be a change in the area of transport, and it was going to be significant on the way people travel and their lifestyle, what do you think that could be? What would be that simple but necessary change? Could it be?
Are you giving me a magic wand, or are you giving me a golden bullet?
We can talk about anything here. We can talk about flying cars. We can talk about changing culture.
If we didn't. I'm not big on. Again, it's another technology where we could introduce that, but I don't really like the idea of noisy flying cars going above my head. Going back to your question, what would I do, or what would I introduce? Probably road user pricing. Going back to my previous point, I think we need the polluter pays principle applied to the rest of the industry. When I say the industry, I mean particularly the motor industry. With the rise of electrification and the decrease and the drop in fuel tax that government will be able to charge, I think you've got a really interesting dynamic where you could imagine government wanting to charge electric vehicles at source rather than per mile. I think that's a really interesting change in how we tax mobility. And I think with that, we could generally try and charge bigger vehicles are driving in areas we don't want them to.
To conclude on the podcast today, tell me about your favorite journey. Now, I want to know where you're going, what mode of travel did you choose to go, and what did you experience along the way?
It's have to be on e-cargo bikes.
Mm-hmm.
Big fan of e-cargo bikes. So the most enjoyable one was a pedal me going to a music festival a few years
Mm-hmm.
ago in East London with my wife and I on the front of it. It was brilliant, really nice along the canals, and being driven by someone else was a real experience. But the most useful journey I've done recently was renting an e-cargo bike to go to a garden centre and do all those bits and bobs I needed to do in central and North London, and that was really cool. It was a few quid for an afternoon, and yeah, that's fantastic. I think you feel really safe on them. The power ratio is really good, and yeah, I can't wait to buy one.
Amazing. I think cargo bikes are fascinating way to travel. We've got mums and dads taking their kids to school on them nowadays. We've got entire couriers changing their business model and switching from vans to cargo bikes. And we'll actually explore that in another episode with our friends over at Pedal Me. Should be a really interesting pod. Yeah,
I'm glad I said that.
Great company, fantastic. Well, thank you, Joe, for your time today. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. I know I'm seeing you this afternoon for the big Micromobility Alliance meetup. So until then, thank you very much.